Virginia Holocaust Museum, Keneseth Beth Israel, and the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond. Welcome to our commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. and Mrs. Marcus and Carol Weinstein for all of their support, as well as the staff here at the museum and my fellow museum board members, and to recognize the presence of our founder, Mr. Jay Ibsen. I'd like to thank our Senator Mark Warner for sending in pre-recorded comments about today's increasing problems of Aryanism and American Nazism. And thank you and welcome to my co-panelist, the German ambassador to the United States, Madam Ambassador Emily Haber, and our very own Congresswoman here in the 7th District, Representative Abigail Spanberger. I'm pleased to welcome this evening's moderator, Melissa Weiss, who graciously agreed to oversee our discussion as she represents Jewish Insider, a relatively new and impressive national Jewish media outlet. Most importantly, we have Shoah survivor Halina Zimm, who withstood the onslaught of murderous anti-Semites to move to Richmond and raise a Jewish family with her beloved late husband, Alan Zimm, Zichron Livracha, and together they taught the Commonwealth's future generations their story and to also project love and tolerance. Friends, we gather here on the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention that besides being the rabbi of Keneseth Beth Israel, Richmond's oldest traditional shul, and a trustee of the Virginia Holocaust Museum, I'm also the grandchild of Ruth and Arthur Yulo of blessed memory, whose families were murdered by the German Nazi government, which was elected to power in 1932. And 77 years ago, this coming spring, my grandmother's sister, who was but a child, and my grandmother's mother were gassed to death with Zyklon B and thrown in an oven, thereby eliminating the final member of my family from the soil of Germany after many, many centuries of being proud, contributing members of German society. Today, we remember that their stories are representative of millions of other Jews who had the audacity to be a part of Am Yisrael and Torat Yisrael, the Jewish people. While many of us here with this history have an anger yet to subside, we also have a conviction to prevent radical and violent intolerance from taking root once again. With that comes a moral imperative to work towards a thriving mutual understanding. I am grateful for the presence of the ambassador, for through our correspondence, I've seen a dignitary with a thoughtful, compassionate manner, full of resolve to ensure that the democratic values of 21st century Germany endure, while simultaneously today's Federal Republic of Germany continuously takes responsibility for Western civilization's worst historic genocide. I'm also grateful for one of the great listeners and one of the most sincere members of Congress, our own representative, who has repeatedly shown up to the Jewish community to learn more about our unique experience. From the Richmond Jewish Food Festival to our meetings on the Hill, if only there was a member of the Bundestag in the 1930s who would have taken that meeting and that concerned message from my grandparents' families up to Hitler's party officials to voice objections on their behalf more strongly. Lastly, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight for this important conversation. Anti-Semitism of all extremes is growing once again to try to target Jewish communities all over the world. And the conversation we will be having will be most effective as we sensitize ourselves towards solutions. It is now my distinct honor and privilege to turn the proceedings over to Halina Zimm, a heroic survivor and educator in our midst, for the program's opening remarks. Thank you. Halina, you're on mute. Please take yourself off of mute.
What the hell is this?
Okay.
Oh.
Go.
Well, my story, it's a very long story, but since we have so little time, so I'll just tell you very briefly that I came from a family of 3 girls, including myself, and I was born in Lodge, and from very, very large family. Uncles and aunts and cousins, but we're the only one, the 3 of us miraculously survived. I have to talk most about my father because he was so important in our lives. My father somehow had a vision, I don't know, right vision or foresight. He knew what's coming. He did everything possible for us to survive. It was his mission. He was so passionate about. He thought about it all the time. I want my children to survive. I want them to survive. I mean, that was his mission. He says, I am 45 years old. I live my life. I want my children to live. He looked for different ways. How can you survive? Well, he was able to reach out to some not Jewish people, but they were Gentiles. They were able to give us the papers from their own children. The woman that came to us and gave us the papers, she was definitely a righteous Gentile. She sacrificed actually her whole life by doing it. She never told her husband or the kids. She gave her identity papers to me and my sister. She refused to take my middle sister. My sister always has some issues. She's afraid that she would not be the right person, that she was afraid to take it. So I don't know how long I can speak, but one thing I tell you, I have endured a lot of problems in my life, but I also was very lucky all through the life. I have people that helped me. I live very close to the ghetto in Warsaw. I live in Warsaw, and every single day I would go to the market to buy some grocery to bring it home, because I live for, I was employed by a couple, very aristocracy, husband and wife, they're very young, and he went to work for Germans. He was an engineer, he was transporting food back and forth, so we had plenty of food in the house. But she had a lot of hate. She was the only child. She had everything. She was married. She had a beautiful husband. They never lacked anything. Beautiful neighbors and friends. But she showed a lot of hate. My father always told me, don't you ever reveal to anyone who you are. You can't trust anyone. So it was so, what my father said, it was so engraved in my memory, I could never forget it. Because you can't trust anybody. Your name is Wanda Kazusek, and that's the way you have to live your life. You can't, unfortunately, there are bad people everywhere. So when I worked for that woman, I would go every single day to the market, and I used to see the ghetto now. So the people looking through the window with such an envy that I can walk around, and they were locked in the ghettos. They were surrounded by all the Nazis and soldiers. But it was something happened to me while I was walking in the street of Warsaw. Somebody recognized it. 1 million people live in Warsaw, and it was bad luck that this woman happened to, didn't even know me very well. She knew me very briefly, because every year we would go to my grandparents to visit them in a little village where they lived. When she saw me, and my heart started beating, I knew something bad's gonna happen. But you know that 1 day, 2 days passed by, and I didn't even think about it. So as usual, I say I used to go to the market to buy groceries, and I would make breakfast for the lady that I was working for. And when I opened my door, and we had a very long corridor, it was a beautiful apartment, and I noticed there were shadows, and there was a German had a gun stuck in my back, and there was Paul in a trench coat. They escorted me into the living room where she was sitting. Well, obviously, the German officer was very impressed with the woman, but she was very cultured. We had a beautiful baby piano, and the Paul started to interrogate me. What is your name? Well, I don't want to get into it. That would take too long. But the thing that he asked me mostly that I didn't know. I knew how to pray. I knew I used to go to church every week, but I never learned what it means to go to communion. In Christianity, Christians, when the children are 7 years old, they have a communion. And he tricked me, the Paul, when he asked me, have you ever gone to the communion? I said, yes. He said, well, what does the priest do to you? He got me. I didn't know. So I was so scared and I started crying. And she got up to crying. I said, you're a Jew. The Paul got up and said, what you said, it is not true. If you're a Paul, if you're a Christian, you know that. Get up. You go with me on the Commemoration, you know it's going to happen to you. You're a Jew, you're going to be shot. At that point, I started screaming. She got up. She was a very beautiful woman. And I was very close to her. I love this woman because I wanted to be everything. Look, I was only 15 years old. I wanted to be just like her because she really was very good to me, but I never revealed to her, never, that I was a Jew. No matter what happened. I talked about other things. I was very young and there were little guys in the neighborhood. I tell the things like that, but never who I was. But she got up. She says, wait a minute. I know this child. She's been living with me for 2 years. She says, Wanda, go in the kitchen, show your papers. You know, oh yeah. But anyway, she saved my life at the time. She did. She persuaded them that I am not a Jew. She put her jewelry on the table. She said, I guarantee you that the child is not Jewish. You know, that it trusted her, they believed her, because they thought to themselves, why would she risk her life? So anyway, but the point I want to make, she saved my life because she didn't know that I was a Jew. But when her mother came and she told her the story, she said, you know that if I would been here, I had Wanda saying what she said, I would say, she's a Jew, take it away. And the reason I'm bringing it up here, that this same woman had a lot of hate. And where did she hate? She got it from home. But when they left, when the officer, German officer and the Paul left, they said, you're going to write to your parents. They're going to be another Banda Kazusa. We'll know where to find you. We know where to find you. But they never came back. My sister said, you must leave the place. I said, no, I have no place to live, to go. And I remained there, but they never came. But the same woman that I loved so much, there was an incident when the Warsaw Ghetto was burning. We lived so close to the Warsaw Ghetto, very close. I would go every day. I would press fire and I saw the people looking at me, begging for food. It was broke my heart. I couldn't do anything. And when the Warsaw Ghetto was burning, because the Jews made the uprising, they knew they're going to die anyway. So what they did is they made the uprising. And the uprising actually lasted 2 months. They were very brave. But you know, Germany was a tremendous power. They came with the plane and the tanks, destroyed the ghetto. And all night long, we could hear the weeping. They knew the people hiding, the kids were hiding in the basement, dynamite the basement. The ghetto was burning. But since we lived so close to the ghetto, people lived in the building, everybody came out. They were afraid that the flame was going to reach the building. I'm standing outside looking at the burning ghetto. And she stayed with me, her husband, the three of us. And the screaming was so powerful. Listening to burning bodies. And I cried. And she said, Wanda, why are you crying? I said, because I feel so sorry for they dying there. I will never forget that. I could never forget this woman that I love. She said, Wanda, she put her arms around me. Wanda, I feel sorry for them as human beings, but as Jews, let them burn. Think about a horrible statement. It was so powerful for me at 15 years old, love and respect a woman. She was young, she was only 25 years old. I felt like somebody would stick a dagger right my back. But when that's why I'm bringing it up, her mother. Where did she get to hate? Why did she hate? She didn't know these people. But the people, I realized that they came actually from home. Her mother. Look what the mother said, take her away, she's a Jew. That's the hate came from. And that's what I always talk. Hate is so destructive, so mean, so hateful. But you know, I stayed there. I never left because I didn't know a place to go. It's a long, long story. I can't get into it. I even worked, believe it or not, I was in this uprising with the Poles when uprising. And a lot of Jews came out because they thought that the Russians were going to liberate us. They never came. They never came, but I never revealed my identity, never. Even after the war, even when the war was ended, I tell everybody my name is Vanna Kasusik. My father and my mother died in Treblinka. Treblinka was one of the worst concentration camps. Nobody came alive. It's what you call a death camp. Nobody. And you know, my parents died. And some people say, why didn't you say could have been a Christian get it, pagan? I couldn't do that. My father and my mother died because they were Jews. I could never do this. But the hate is very destructive. That's what I always talked about. I promised myself that I'm gonna always talk to the children, young people, to talk hate. Hate is destructive, very hurtful, and you know, it can consume you. Hate. I've seen hate, but I was lucky to have wonderful people in my life. There was a time, if I can still talk, there was a time, I believe it or not, I want you to all hear, I even worked for the German army, in the kitchen, and they never knew I was a Jew. And then one night, something happened because wherever the Germans soldiers were driving, moving back because the Russians were chasing them, they was always toward the one, we are following them. So one day at night, everything stopped. I didn't know what happened. It was a big commotion. And I found out next day that every woman, there were 10 women, Polish women, worked for the Germans in the kitchen. And everybody was raped except me. I asked my question so many times, why was I saved? Why didn't I come to my place? They protected me. They liked me. I liked the guys. They're plain German soldiers. And I was very friendly and they liked me. I was the youngest. They saved me. Think about it. And many years I said, why didn't I come to me? They never did. I had so many wonderful things happen to me in my life. I think my father and mother prayed for me because they wanted so much for us to live. And think about it, although there were 3 of us and everyone survived, which is most unusual because of goodness of people. There are still good people in this world.
Halina?
My husband was in concentration camp. He had different experiences than mine. But I preach love, not hate.
Thank you, Halina. Thank you very much. Appreciate your message. It's such an important message for all of Virginia's students. It's at this time that I'd like to introduce our moderator, Melissa Weiss.
Good job.
Weiss is the managing editor for Jewish Insider. Prior to joining Jewish Insider, she spent nearly a decade working in strategic communications in the nonprofit sector. And following stints in Seoul and in Washington, D.C., she currently lives now in New York City. Melissa is a graduate of the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Melissa, welcome to Virginia.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. Like you just said, I'm Melissa Weiss, the managing editor of Jewish Insider. We're a news site and daily email brief that arrives in your inbox first thing every weekday morning. Now, as a bonus for joining us this evening, we're giving all of you access to Jewish Insider's daily kickoff, which you'll hopefully see bright and early in your inbox tomorrow. Now let's meet tonight's speakers. Emily Haber has been the German ambassador to the United States since June 2018. Previously, Haber, a career Foreign Service officer, was deployed to the Federal Ministry of the Interior, serving as state secretary overseeing security and migration at the height of Europe's refugee crisis. In 2009, she was appointed political director, and in 2011, state secretary at the Foreign Office, the first woman to hold either post. U.S. Representative Abigail Spanberger has represented Virginia's 7th Congressional District, which is comprised of 10 counties throughout Central Virginia, since 2019. Representative Spanberger began her career in public service, first serving as a federal agent with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, investigating money laundering and narcotics cases, and then serving as a case officer with the CIA, working counterterrorism and non-proliferation cases. In the House, Representative Spanberger serves on the House Committee on Agriculture and the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Rabbi Dovid serves as the senior rabbi of Keneseth, Beth, Israel, Richmond's traditional synagogue since 1856, and one of the Jewish community's fastest growing congregations. He's also the rabbi of Bon Secours Mercy Health, Richmond. He's a trustee of the Virginia Holocaust Museum and a board member for Jewish Community Federation of Richmond and the Yeshiva of Virginia. Rabbi Asher sits on the National Executive Committee for the Rabbinical Council of America and is an active leader within AIPAC. Now, before we get started, we've got a message from Senator Mark Warner, who would have liked to be here tonight, but was unable to join us. Senator Warner, who previously served as the governor of Virginia, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008, where he serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committees, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence, where he's the vice chairman. Now, we had a couple of issues with the audio, so I'd advise you all to turn up your volume right now. And if that still doesn't work, don't worry. We'll be emailing out his video after tonight's event.
Hello, I'm Virginia Senator Mark Warner, and I want to thank Rabbi Asher for inviting me to say a few words as we honor International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I can remember visiting the Virginia Holocaust Museum a number of times as governor, and very proud of the fact that Virginia is one of 16 states that has a Holocaust museum. We need to have this kind of remembrance because, as we've seen as recently as a few weeks ago, anti-Semitism, white nationalism, white racial supremacy efforts have not disappeared from our country. As we saw those literally thousands of thugs rampage through the halls of our capital, sometimes wearing shirts that were anti-Semitic, this kind of racial hatred has no place in America or, for that matter, in the world. It's why all of those individuals who broke into the Capitol need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Unfortunately, here in Virginia, what happened at the Capitol a few weeks ago was not the only example of this kind of anti-Semitism and white nationalism rear its ugly head in Virginia. We saw almost a forecoming of what happened on January 6th, a couple years back in Charlottesville, when again, white nationalists and their supporters marched through the grounds of UVA, shouting anti-Semitic slogans, anti-Black slogans, and others. So I commend all involved in International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I commend these very important conversations. We have to stamp out racism wherever it appears, whether it be anti-Black, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, any kind of racial prejudice that and religious prejudice that manifests and rears its ugly head. So thank you for these important conversations. Thank you for the great work you do year in and year out. And let us never forget. Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. So we've received dozens of questions for our panel tonight. While we won't get to them all, a number of the folks tuning in have had a lot of the same things on their minds, so I've done my best to combine questions. I think the first thing on everyone's mind these days is what we saw earlier this month at the US Capitol. Many of you will remember the image of the man wearing a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. He was far from the only anti-Semitic neo-Nazi in Washington that day, and a reminder to Jews and non-Jews alike that not everyone has learned the lessons of the Holocaust. So we're going to talk a little bit today about Holocaust education, both here in the US and in Germany. Now, Ambassador, this first one's for you, and it comes from Amy Milnick-Scharf, the late chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Richmond. Could you explain the current requirements for Holocaust education in Germany and more broadly in the European Union? And as a follow-up, what can America learn from Germany in that respect?
On Holocaust education. Holocaust education is mandatory in German schools. Every German student learns about the Holocaust in the 9th or 10th grade, and sometimes also in the 8th grade. It's in the history context, but also in social study context, in literature, in religion and ethics. And all of that is combined with visits to memorials, to museums. So it's very much part and parcel of the education. But that alone is not sufficient. What Germany did try as the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was to actually make education a tool for combating stereotypes, make education a tool for combating Holocaust distortion and trivialization. It is so necessary given different legal systems, given different experiences and given different contexts, that we actually identify what trivialization or misrepresentation of distortion of the Holocaust is and how to combat it. And that needs to be not only part of the curriculum in schools and in universities, but also in the training of police and the judiciary. So what we try to do is realizing the shifting shape of anti-Semitism today, which is very much online, which requires a much greater deal of coordination and adaptation than it used to in the past. And to the second part of your question, what can the United States learn? That is something really that I can and will not answer, because Germany, as we all know, is the country where the Holocaust originated. And the United States is the country which opened the arms for refugees coming from Europe, fleeing murder and fleeing persecution and fleeing the hatred that both the speakers before have so movingly spoken about. So there is something that you cannot compare and you cannot learn given the different contexts. But what I think is necessary for all of us is that we join forces and that we work together. We live in a hyper-connected world, and contagion of hatred travels incredibly fast. And if we don't combine what we actually can do and use education as a tool against hatred and against distortion of the historical truth, and against a sense of responsibility for the present and the future, then we will all suffer from it.
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Spanberger, this question's inspired by Miriam Davidow. She's a community leader and a member of the museum's board of directors. Now, Congress last year passed legislation dedicating federal funding to Holocaust education. As we've seen, though many states have mandated Holocaust education, that does not fully resolve issues of ignorance, anti-Semitism, and hate. What more can Congress do to both make sure the next generation is taught the lessons of the Holocaust and that the current one doesn't forget?
Well, this is a particularly powerful question, especially as we've seen in Melissa in your introductory remarks when you were speaking about the attacks that we saw on the United States Capitol and the images and imagery and words that are so clearly anti-Semitic and rooted in hatred and bias. So I think from a congressional standpoint, there are many things we can do. We can continue to appropriate funding, recognizing the importance that Miriam mentioned. But beyond that, we can be examples, because right now we are at a pivotal point in our history as a nation where we are seeing a move away, and I wrote notes when the ambassador was speaking, where she was talking about the distortion of historical truth. And we are at a point right now where the distortion of truth is a threat to our democracy, is a threat to our understanding within our communities. And so while many people are focused on what happened on January 6th, that does have a clear link to the far right extremists, white nationalists, people wearing clear anti-Semitic, you mentioned the Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. This was motivated by hate. It is an underpinning of who those attackers and insurrectionists were, but this was not the first time in even just the past couple of years that these individuals have come forward with their hatred. It is in online chat rooms. It was present at the desecration of Jewish cemeteries, at the murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and certainly in Charlottesville. So what members of Congress can do is recognize the reality of where we are right now, which is in a dangerous time in our history, particularly with that ongoing distortion of truth. Because as people are willing to disconnect from the real risks that exist because of hate, because of anti-Semitism, because of racism, that shifting shape of anti-Semitism that the ambassador spoke about is clear, and it's present in our society. So from a congressional standpoint, making very clear our denunciation of anti-Semitism in all its forms, which we've done in the form of resolutions, committing ourselves to education as we've done in the form of funding, but most importantly, it is aggressively denouncing and making clear that incidents of violence and hate that are rooted in white nationalism are linked. And as they are allowed to take root, they will become more dangerous into the future. So aggressively fighting them in all that we do, in every time we have a public platform, I think is incredibly important.
Thank you. Rabbi Asher, how would you say that local groups and synagogues like your own can be best supported as you look to educate the next generation about the Holocaust?
I think that's it's a great question. It's a big honor for me to be here with all of you, so thank you. I'm very concerned because when people come to services on Shabbat morning and they have to look over their shoulder and they have to think of what happened in Pittsburgh and they have to think of what happened in Charleston, and then they turn on the news and it's very difficult because it makes people feel very unsafe. And when you have that in your personal history, when there were 9 million Jews who lived on the continent of Europe, and now there are only 1.5 million Jews, you know that fact, and you know what happened to your friends and family. So you can combine all of this, and the trauma doesn't necessarily go away. So really, it's just understanding that as much as we might want to be regular Americans, and we might want to go about our lives in a certain way, we have targets that unfortunately throughout history have been on our back, and there's a certain sensitivity which we would like people to try to understand. When countries shout death to Israel, we want people to understand that we don't have the freedom to think that that might not be accurate. When there are politicians who are on one side of the extreme that put us down as colonialists when we ran for our lives, it's very painful. When there are people who refer to us still today with white supremacy as subhuman, it brings back everything that we experience in our history books. Because for us, the history classes, they're not history classes. It's our story. It's who we are. It's our life. So I think it's really just when we go to lobby, when we go to talk to politicians, when we have the ability to engage with ambassadors in Europe today, and especially when it comes to Germany, just to have that validated. Because when you walk down the street in the 7th District here in Virginia and you get heckled and harassed because you're walking to a synagogue, you know that you don't feel safe because there is some real violence behind what just seems like ignorant talk. So it's just a matter of being fully validated. And then that's number one. And then number two, it's a matter of thoughtful ideas to try to put forward what can happen. And hopefully during the course of this conversation, we can talk about some of the really difficult issues of free speech versus, versus clamping down on anti-Semitism. And I think that's what's fascinating to think of Germany and with America. And we'll see where the conversation goes. But thank you very much for the question.
Sure, thank you. Ambassador Haber, in your time at the Federal Ministry of the Interior, you oversaw security and migration during the EU's refugee crisis. How should Germany and the EU handle migrants coming from parts of Asia and Africa that don't teach tolerance?
Not only don't teach tolerance, but they have different ideas of how a state should work. They come with different vantage points and prisms with regard to Israel. They come with different views of human dignity and the right of women. Mind you, I'm not saying this is that's a general phenomenon. Many of the refugees that arrived in Europe in 1915 and 2015 and 16 arrived because they fled persecution and they fled war. But the fact remains, they came with their own equipment of convictions, experiences, and vantage points. Now, that a country like Germany, which is a committed democracy, and by the way, Rabbi, when you said for us Jews, it's our personal stories, I would make the point that for Germans and for Germany, this history is also part of our identity. And we wouldn't be where we are today as a democracy and as committed to fighting for human rights and human dignity. We wouldn't be there without the awareness and the knowledge and remembrance, which is part of our identity. I just wanted to make the point because it's important to me. And because it's important to my country and my government and to our identity of what we want to be, it was important to us also, while doing what we could and continuing to do what we can in order to integrate people who arrive in Germany and usually flee for a whole host of reasons. We needed to make clear that there's zero tolerance on a number of aspects and issues. One of them is our history. Another is human dignity, and that women and people who don't share your belief and gay people, etc., they all enjoy the same entitlement to dignity, and we were not going to compromise on that. Here again, education is key, and there's something we really can learn from the American example, because education has been hugely important in the American integration story as well. And that needs to start as early as it possibly can. But I'm not saying it's not a challenge, because it is, and it continues to be one, and it probably will be a generational task.
Thank you. Congresswoman Spanberger, there are some incoming members of the House of Representatives who've espoused controversial beliefs and dabbled in QAnon, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. When Democrats had a similar problem after the 2018 elections, with some members espousing what could be considered anti-Semitic tropes, congressional reactions were varied, ranging from private conversations hoping to teach and explain to public denunciations. What do you think is the right course of action in dealing with these new members who hold problematic views?
So I would take it a step further and say the views are far beyond problematic. They are dangerous, and I classify them as dangerous because they are not living in reality. They're based on lies. They're based on conspiracy theories. And I think at times we've looked at QAnon, looked at conspiracy theories, and had a conversation about, wow, that's really far out there, or wow, that's really nutty. But in fact, when an entire group of people think that there's a conspiracy of lawmakers involved in a pedophile ring based in the basement of a pizza. And it sounds ridiculous as I say the words. This is dangerous because people believe it. And it's dangerous because people believe it. It's dangerous because people who want to be a part of something are drawn to this group. And in my background as a CIA officer, I spent a lot of time focused on counterterrorism issues and anti-radicalization issues. And much of what I worked on was this notion of people get pulled into a sense of belonging. And when that sense of belonging and that sense of who they are has a component that they base in a religion or in a kind of mission-focused, driven purpose, that is particularly dangerous. And so the QAnon beliefs and conspiracies that have taken hold should be a glaring red light. Unfortunately, throughout the history of the Western world, so many of these conspiracies have been grounded and founded in anti-Semitic views, clear anti-Semitism, clear tropes. And so I think in the past, when Congress has denounced certain sentences, certain tweets, certain statements that were, myself included, that we viewed as being offensive, insensitive, wrong, anti-Semitic, I think it is incredibly important that as we're looking at the more dangerous, large-scale conspiracies that that are leading people towards a path, as we saw on January 6th, of violence, that we need to be very clear that this is a culminating and building problem that, you know, we saw it become violent in the attack, the Unite the Right attack in Charlottesville. We saw them saying outrageous, horrific, anti-Semitic things. And bit by bit, the fever pitch is growing. And so now the fact that there are people who don't recognize the reality of truth, of history, of the Holocaust, or even who would trivialize it, as that one man did in the t-shirt, the sweatshirt that's known kind of to everyone watching. We cannot say, well, that's just a different belief system, because those are the conspiracies upon which dangerous, anti-democratic, terrible, violent things happen. And we have to denounce that actual foundation, because otherwise it'll just be too late before everyone realizes what is going wrong.
Now, many QAnon adherents argue that the First Amendment protects them. So my question is, where is that dividing line that splits between protected speech versus speech that's punishable? And I mean, that's a Congresswoman, that's a question for you here. And then Ambassador, I would love to get a better understanding of what free speech means in Germany.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, if you could, please.
So, you know, I think we are in the United States, and I'm not an attorney, so for the attorneys on the line, I welcome you to differ with me, but as a lawmaker and someone who focuses my day-to-day on the constitutionality of what we're working on, the First Amendment, of course, is everything to us. And so, you know, in this country, we have a right to say terrible things. We have a right to believe, in fact, terrible, hateful things. But we do not have a right to our own facts. And we, as the people around those who would say things that are wrong or hateful, have, I would say, a duty to recognize and denounce those things. And when those words become a call to violence, and when those words endanger others, then that's where one's freedom to say something hateful must end. And, you know, there's that's been held up by the Supreme Court in terms of yelling fire in a crowded theater, et cetera. But again, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to hateful words, we cannot wait till it's gone too far. We have to be clear. And those of us who have a voice, and sometimes it's an issue of understanding. I am privy to some of the conversations that some of my colleagues have had with other colleagues explaining why certain words that they use are in fact terribly offensive or hurtful based on a history that others may not understand. So I think that there are places where education, to go back to the earlier point, is incredibly important. Rabbi Asher, when talking about the personal experience, that's not an experience that everyone has or can relate to. That's the value of walking through the Holocaust Museum in Richmond, recognizing that words and some blame of societal ills on particular groups of people, that became the foundation for the fact that millions of people were murdered. And so when it comes to free speech, it is a prized reality, a constitutional value to be defended and upheld, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. And I think particularly those with amplified voices, those in elected office, those with a greater platform have the responsibility of using it in a way that makes clear what is acceptable and unacceptable in our society, and makes very clear when we are seeing the foundation blocks of bias, racism, anti-Semitism being built up in a way that it could lead us down a very dangerous and violent path.
Thanks so much. Ambassador?
Well, that's what Rabbi Asher alluded to before when he pointed to the German example, because in our legal system, hate speech, violent speech is not covered by any First Amendment. And that again comes from history, because to quote you again, Rabbi, history has also taught Germans that actually words matter and words can be followed by a reality, and you need to be cautious early on. So there's no protection. There is protection for free speech, but when it oversteps the line to violence, to hatred, to incitement of violence, then we are in the realm of criminal offenses. We even have in recent years adopted two consecutive laws on enforcing that in the online realm as well, where we made the providers responsible for the publication of hate speech, calls for violence, hatred, and so forth. That's something they did not like a lot. I was criticized a lot here in the United States when I was in visiting Silicon Valley, because people did not understand that this was not a reduction of or containment of free speech. It was actually drawing the red line between acceptable free speech and a free speech that is moving towards hatred, inciting hatred, and moving towards violence. So that's a crucial difference. It's informed by different historical experiences, but our experience and our context has been, let's prevent any downhill road that would lead to violence, hatred, discrimination, and in the end of the day, possible persecution.
Melissa, if I can jump in.
Of course.
So just to Madam Ambassador's points, first of all, it's fascinating for us to have this conversation, because the suggestion here is that free speech, if taken to an extreme, can actually infringe on other people's willingness to speak up. It can infringe on their speech. So if there are verbal attacks or other kinds of attacks against the Jewish community, like in Germany, they might be less likely to speak up. So how to balance free speech is really critical part of this conversation. Just, Madam Ambassador, just from my perspective, and then one other comment on the Congresswoman's remarks, which is that while I do think that it's very much a part of Germany, and when I went to Aschaffenburg to visit my family history, I went to the house, the address where my grandmother lived, and I tried to just get acquainted with it. And she explained to me that the house was not the original house, it was bombed. And like so many Germans, there was suffering and there was destruction and there was terrible poverty and there was an extremism that took over the country, which even though many Germans supported the Nazi government, certainly Germany as a whole, I think from my perspective, was really suffering for many, many years. But the difference is that the Jewish communities don't exist anymore. And even though it's a part of, let's say, the history of Germany, there is no more history to talk about when it comes to German Jewry because it was basically finished off. And just one other point with regards to our Congresswoman is that I think that most of my congregants, most people in the synagogue, hear from what happened this past week or the week before with regards to Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who said that Israel is deciding who can and cannot get the vaccine based on race. And, this is kind of something that we're dealing with in terms of blood libel from Europe perpetuating itself here in our new adopted country of America. And I think that maybe we would like to hear some inside Washington conversation about some of that, if possible. Not that I'm not asking the questions, but I'm replying back to some of the other topics, which I think, and I'll tell you why, because in the local Richmond paper, Congresswoman, so it's printed, not an editorial, perhaps not German newspapers in the 1930s, but it's printed about this kind of racism which exists in Israel. When it comes to QAnon, we don't have letters to the editor kind of describing these conspiracy theories and then the Times Dispatch going ahead and printing it. But the made up lies or libel is something which you hear from relatively respectable sources being espoused as if they're, or being spoken about as if they're truths. So I'm just interjecting.
Melissa, can I go ahead and make a comment on Rabbi Asher's comment? You speak to a really important point, not surprisingly, which is the fact that there is, and to be clear, I find it wholly unacceptable, but there are some people who, when talking about Israel as a nation, Israelis as a people, call upon and utilize, it's more than a trope. I don't want to say a trope because I think that in fact undermines the significance of the stereotypes, the kind of power dynamics that are put at play. And then I will say the comment that you're referencing, I hadn't yet heard, so I'll have to go and look that one up. Based on what you said, is grossly disappointing. That again, kind of time after time, there would be this stereotype of a particular power that exists with a particular group of people. In this case, a particular power existing with Jewish people. That is as old of an anti-Semitic trope as exists. This notion that there's kind of I think someone put it in the comments, like a cabal type power. And so I denounce that because it's hurtful. Because at the top line, it doesn't seem that it is as full of hate as it is, right? But because, and I know I'm saying so many things that people know, but if you say I hate this group because, or this group is bad because, that's a clear conversation that someone can choose to enter or not. But when you create this notion that this group of people is different for a particular reason, On its face, it's not necessarily an offensive or a hateful statement, but it creates this otherizing, it creates this different position. And when we're in a nation where we're facing tremendous issues across the board, not the least of which, or the most profound at this point, is a pandemic, then the notion that, again, this power structure somehow plays into who gets a vaccine or who doesn't. And again, I'll have to go in and dig into that comment, but it is, again, playing on that notion that there's a different group. And it becomes, as we've seen throughout history, as was the case with Nazi Germany, it was that notion that this group is in a distinct position. This group has power, this group, and again, on its face doesn't feel like a particularly hateful statement, but it creates that divide where you can otherize people into a point where they become to blame for all of, whatever rationale you want to put behind that hatred. So to be very clear, that's, again, with the foundation of hatred and the foundation of otherizing, it's a conspiracy that someone can start to believe, and there are multiple steps down into that conspiracy before it becomes violent, before it becomes overtly anti-Semitic. And that's the really dangerous part, because it becomes a slippery slope where initially they start to accept these stereotypes, which push them heavily towards that place of significant hatred or significant anti-Semitism.
Can I just jump in with 2 sentences? Rabbi, I think you misunderstood me when I said that the awareness and the knowledge of history was deeply ingrained in the German culture. What I meant was the knowledge of the persecution and the genocide of European Jewry is part of the German identity today. It defines what we can do, what we want to be, and how we want to act. It defines our sense of responsibility for the world around us. It defines our handling of the what you would call the First Amendment, and so forth. So I wasn't commenting on Germany. I was commenting on the role of the awareness of crimes that have been inflicted on European Jewry in the name of my country, a different country, but it was Germany, a different country than the Germany today, but it was Germans. And that defines the way we look at politics and our responsibility of it today.
Thank you. And I'll just note that Germany is one of the fastest growing Jewish communities.
Yes.
In Europe, which is of course speaks to a lot of the progress. All right, sorry, Melissa. I just
No, don't worry. We are just about out of time. There's plenty more still to talk about, but unfortunately, we don't have all night.
talk about how we got to this point in terms of how we all met each other, in terms of this panel, in terms of the Supreme Court case.
All right. Well, let's get to this. We'll do one more question on the Supreme Court case.
Okay.
So this is actually really timely. There was an article today in the New York Times about another piece of art that is going through all sorts of debate over property ownership. So a little bit of a background here for those of you tuning in. Descendants of those killed in the Holocaust often encounter challenges recovering items that were looted or that their relatives were forced to sell at criminally low rates in the years leading up to the Holocaust. Statutes of limitations, other German laws, and the lack of authority granted to the country's advisory commission, which was created to arbitrate between victims and those who currently possess property, have all made it very difficult for the individuals to reclaim their family's items. Now, Ambassador and Congresswoman, you both have been involved in a recent Supreme Court case over a medieval art collection sold by a Holocaust victim at the onset of the Holocaust. What more can be done to help descendants of Holocaust victims reclaim property that had belonged to their family? And what's more, to legally bind current property owners to paying restitution? Ambassador, I'll let you start.
Yeah, thank you. May I just say, the Supreme Court case is not a restitution case. The case at the Supreme Court is only about the question whether sovereign states can be sued at the courts in civil cases of other countries. That's the principle of state immunity. And this and only this is is before the Supreme Court now. And that's a principle of international law the United States supported too, and that's why the State Department is actually supporting it by an amicus curiae brief. Now, it's not on substance, and the case can be filed before any German court. It's not on substance. It's just on the issue of state immunity. And may I say that Germany is has assigned the Washington Principle about the restitution and return of looted art, and we have assigned the commitment to identify and return property that had been looted or had been sold at prices that were practically extraction. But again, this case is not about about restitution. It's only about the principle of state immunity.
I appreciate the clarification. But I mean, to that end, there's still a vast amount of art that, and not just art, but property in general that has belonged to Holocaust victims that has been tied up in years of litigation and legal debate. So how do we move that process forward while there are still people and documentation and evidence of past property ownership?
As I said, we supported the Washington Principles. We set up a commission whose only duty it is to identify art that has been looted and stolen or sold at inappropriate prices, and artifacts that need to return. To the best of my knowledge, up to now, 16,000 artifacts have been returned on the basis of decisions the commission had been taken. And any case can be taken to court as well. So my government is deeply committed to right that wrong, which is art that has been looted, stolen, or sold at inappropriate prices, or purchases that have been enforced, actually.
Thank you. Congressman, do you have anything to add?
So I would, from a congressional standpoint, and the ambassador and I have corresponded a couple times on this issue. And so just kind of for note, there's been a number of congressional actions in recent years focused on the theft of art, the expropriated art. And I would just point to back in 2017, Congress passed, it was called the Justice for Uncompensated Survivors Today Act. And in response to that, the State Department released a report as required by the Just Act. And I think there's a statement in it that's an important from a historical context, or that the Holocaust, the quote is, "The Holocaust was one of the largest organized thefts in human history. The Nazi regime's confiscation, seizure, and wrongful transfer of the Jewish people's property were designated not only to enrich the Nazi regime at the expense of the European Jewry, but also to permanently eliminate all aspects of Jewish cultural life." And so from a congressional standpoint, before I got there and ongoing, is a focus on ensuring that as we look towards the future and look upon what happened with the Holocaust, that we look of course, at the actual, the killing and the deaths, but also the economic crimes that were meant to, generally speaking, eliminate the wealth, the existence, and the very being of European Jewry. And in 2016, there's been a variety of different pieces of legislation focused on the ability to reclaim art and other pieces or personal family items that had been taken or sold at non-competitive rights because of the circumstances that Jewish families, the forced transfer and forced sales, forced purchase. And so I think continuing, unfortunately, generation by generation, we're getting further away from perhaps the memory of what items belong to which families. But I think it's an important one to continue having a conversation about, primarily because it does speak to the larger reality of the Holocaust, is that it was, of course, the killing of millions of people, but every aspect of their existence in some ways, particularly with their property and their items, eliminating every part of their existence was part of the reality of this crime.
And if I can, Melissa, I just would add that I think when you have so many people today, which we've talked about a little bit, the Holocaust denial, which is growing in terms of numbers of people, and people say that so many Americans, such a high percentage of millennials and what they say is Generation Z, these young people, to a very scary degree, very high numbers, do not believe that 6 million Jews perished. And there's very little left for us to talk about or discuss or negotiate beyond property. We have restitution and there are history classes, but the more property that gets returned to Jewish families, the more we can find that was stolen and return it to their owners. The more that we can do that, the more we can show Holocaust deniers that this was real. And so whether it's, you know, this court case or other court cases, and understand Madam Ambassador's comments about the specifics of this case, but the appearance as a clergy member, the appearance, and as an American Jew, the appearance of justice not being done is highly impactful, and the minutia or the nitty-gritty details are often lost on those that need the clearest understanding. So it does come down a lot to education. Education is very real, but when it comes to justice, as far as court cases and property and restitution are concerned, those are tangible ways of kind of showcasing these points that that genocide happened, and that it will need to be dealt with based on the scale and size of what took place and the destruction that took place.
Well, Rabbi, I completely agree.
Yes.
I just would contend that the case at hand is not a case in point.
Right. In terms of these particulars, yeah, that might be correct, because I'm not a lawyer. But what I can say is that I am concerned about the appearance of what most people will take away in terms of this contention or competition over disputed property, even and the details might be lost on them. It's a concern. I don't know how to deal with that from a legal basis, but just as somebody who's concerned about the safety of the Jewish community, it's I raised the issue because I think it's relevant.
Well, we have more than gone over our time tonight. I want to open it up if anyone has, you know, any last thoughts that they would like to share before we call it a night. The floor is yours.
You have to call on one of us.
Well, just in case not everyone has thoughts. Ambassador, you kicked it off for us. I'll let you kick this off too.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this discussion. It's, as German ambassador, representing a country with this history, and having a discussion with your community on history and on how to deal with it and confront the risks and the threats of tomorrow. That is hugely important to me, and I feel humbled and grateful for the invitation.
Congresswoman.
I want to say thank you, Madam Ambassador, for visiting our district virtually. I want to say thank you for the invitation to join you all tonight. And to the Virginia Holocaust Museum, I think it is incredible the work that the organization continues to do to educate children, to educate adults, to educate Virginians on how quickly and how grotesquely hatred can turn to real violence, death, and mass atrocity. And such a inspiring and beautiful way, the Holocaust Museum makes clear that horror of humanity, that horror of our history, in a way that honors those who lost their lives, and I think calls on all of us to ensure that nothing ever so horrific happens again. So to everyone who puts their time, their energy, and their emotion and support behind that museum, I'm very, very grateful. And to everyone on the line, thank you for inviting me to join today. Melissa, thank you for moderating. And Rabbi Asher, it is always a pleasure to see you, and I'm grateful to serve this community. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the event.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just conclude with a bit of a rabbinic thought. The Jewish calendar has one day on the year in which we are meant to focus on sad events in our history. It's called the 9th of Av. Av is the 2 months before Rosh Hashanah. And in this month of Av, we condense it into this one day on the calendar because there are so many tragedies that are a part of this oldest hatred, that are a part of this anti-Semitism. And we sit on the floor and we record these and mourn the tragedies that took place. And of course, there is a liturgy that's dedicated to the Holocaust as well, certainly more than one. But it is a difficult history, and it's difficult for us to bear this alone, this hatred. And that's why this conversation is so gratifying, to be able to have the representative in our country of the new Germany, of a democratic Germany committed to such values, is a distinct honor and privilege for us, especially here in Central Virginia. And to have a Congresswoman, again, as I said, who always shows up and always willing to listen to the good and to the bad, to the more difficult comments, and always has a thoughtful response and always has consideration, is there for us. So I want to thank everyone who participated, all of the attendees. A special thank you to our moderator, and of course to Halina for her incredible story.
Wow. Is it my turn?
Halina, I turn it over to you to close us out for closing remarks.
Well, listen, guys, I am the oldest. You had to read about history. I am history. I've seen it all. I've seen it all. Look, today is the Remembrance. The atrocities, worst atrocities of the 20th century should not be denied. We must take the dark evil, learn from it. As some deny the Holocaust. That's what bothers me. That's why I go to schools. It is my obligation. And believe me, it's a burden. It is a burden, but it's a responsibility. I have to. And believe me, when I go to the kids, they rejuvenate me. What's the right word? But they really make me feel so, I can't find the right word. But anyway, these kids, they don't have enough. When I come to speak to them, they want to listen. And the thing that I always tell them, always remember that hate is wrong and right is, hate is wrong and love is right. And they always remember that. Wherever I go, I see some students. Oh, Mrs. Zimm, I said, how do you know me? You always, I remember what you said, hate is wrong and love is right. And listen, guys, I have to tell you something. We can never solve the problem unless we listen to each other, for God's sake. Don't listen only to one side of the story. Listen to both sides and listen. Listen is very important. People don't want to listen. You never learn unless you listen, Because
these are, thank you, Mrs. Zimm.
Divide on both sides. We have to listen to each other and they cut me off. Listen to
No, we still hear you. It's such an important message.
Listen to each other and accept people. You know, it's very easy to hate when you don't know people. If you get to know them, it's a different story. Then you know that person, a different story. It's important to listen to each other and talk about wonderful things. That life is still good, and not being depressed. We always have hope. This is a wonderful country that we live in here. We went through many different things, but at the end of it, we're always on top. So
Thank
let's
you.
be optimistic, and let's hope for better tomorrow.
Thank you, Halina. Very wise words, as always. I want to thank everybody for participating and coming once again. This week, there are additional commemorations, Finding Matilda on Wednesday, January 27th, and a concert on January 31st in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's so important to have Remembrance Day so we can hear each other, to listen to each other, to have these important discussions and conversations, and to plan ahead for making sure we have better success for future generations. So thank you all very much for being here. And thank you especially to our guests. Everybody have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Thank you.